These four letters carved on ancient Roman walls, SPQR, they stand for Senatus Populusque Romanus, which is a fancy way of saying the Senate and the people of Rome. It was more than just a motto, it was a promise. The Romans were proud to be free, to live in a republic without an absolute king. They chose their own leaders, and the government was supposed to operate based on their will. Sounds amazing, right? But most of those free Romans were actually living a life of hardship and injustice. The Roman Republic had a massive secret problem, a ticking time bomb that almost tore the whole society apart. It took a single wounded veteran and a massive citywide strike to finally force a change. This is the story of how Rome's ordinary people demanded their rights, how they created the world's first professional army, and how they built an empire that would last for over 1,000 years. Get ready to find out what happened when they realized the old rules weren't working. When the Roman kingdom became a republic in 509 BCE, everything changed, but not for everyone. Rome was divided into two very different groups. You had the patricians, the elite, wealthy class who made up about 5% of the population. They were the ones who held all the power. They were the senators, the judges, and the generals. Then you had the plebeians. That was over 90% of the people. The farmers, the artisans, the laborers. They were the backbone of Rome, but they had very few rights. Their biggest problem? There were no written laws. When a plebeian had a legal dispute, the patrician judges could interpret the law however they wanted. And let's just say it almost always ended badly for the poor guy, especially if the other person was a patrician. These decisions often created painful, unfair situations, and the plebeians were starting to get really angry about it. One day, in the heart of the Roman Forum, a sick, weak, and emaciated old man stood up. He was covered in wounds, and his clothes were tattered. People began to gather, trying to figure out who he was. Then, a gasp went through the crowd. They recognized him. He was a Roman soldier, a veteran, whose bravery had once been celebrated in songs. "Tell us what happened to you," the people demanded. He began to tell his harrowing story. He had left his farm and family to fight for Rome, but when he came back, he discovered that a rich landowner had taken his family farm. With no land and no way to provide for his family, he had to borrow money. When he couldn't pay it back, the landlord took him as a slave. But get this, Roman law said you couldn't enslave a Roman citizen. So the landlord threw him into a private prison and tortured him to force him to pay. The man had somehow escaped and came to the market to show the people what had happened. He turned around, revealing a back covered in deep red scars from the whips. The Roman citizens were absolutely infuriated. This wasn't just a single case. Other plebeians had been losing their farms to wealthy patricians too. The anger boiled over. They decided to take a drastic step. They went on strike. They threatened to stop joining the army, to close their shops, and to abandon all the city's construction projects. They even went so far as to pack up their families and leave the city, threatening to build a new one along the Tiber River. Months passed. Rome's ruling elite class, the patricians, found their lives grinding to a halt. Their luxurious, swaggering lifestyle completely depended on the hard work of the poor. Without the plebeians, the city couldn't function. All work stopped. The rich were finally forced to face the consequences of their actions. Finally, the patricians agreed to negotiate. Around 450 BCE, the senior senators worked with the plebeians to create a brand new code of ethics for all Romans. For the first time, the laws were written down. They were etched onto 12 bronze tablets and displayed in the city for everyone to see. This historic agreement was called the 12 Tables, COM. This was a groundbreaking moment. It was the first codified law in Roman history. It spelled out how courts would work, how judges would be appointed, what family rights were, and what the punishments were for major crimes. It was a game changer. The plebeians now had a voice. They also got a share of the power in the council and the Senate. With the poor involved, the government and the army began to improve. Rome started to grow stronger from the inside, creating new standards for everything, from the quality of roads to a unified currency. But this newfound strength also made them hungry for more. Rome was expanding, and they needed more resources for their growing population. This meant war. To lead their first major expansion, they did something they hated. They temporarily hired a patrician named Camillus as a dictator. He was a temporary ruler with the power of a king, a position they only created for extreme crises. The goal was to conquer their powerful neighbor, the Etruscans, ca. The Etruscans were older, more advanced, and much wealthier than Rome. They were a serious threat. The only thing separating the two powers was the Tiber River. The closest and most powerful Etruscan fortress to Rome was a city called Veii. Camillus led a long siege, and when he finally broke through, he attacked the city and massacred every single citizen. After that, the Romans advanced, burning down every symbol and settlement of Etruscan civilization. Today, you won't find a single word, a single piece of writing, or a descendant from this advanced civilization. They were completely wiped out. This brutal treatment of their enemies was also a core part of the Roman nature. They did it in the name of self-defense. But soon, they would face an enemy even more fearless than them. In 390 BCE, Gaul tribes from the north of Italy, where France is now, attacked Rome. The Roman army had beaten them before, but this time, the Gauls united under a new chief named Brennus, FS. They ambushed the Roman army on the banks of the Elia River and completely destroyed them. The Roman soldiers were cut down like wheat. The survivors ran back to the city shouting that the barbarians have come. Instead of fighting, the Romans evacuated the city and took refuge on a nearby hill, the Capitoline Hill, a strong fortress that could withstand a long siege. The Gauls surrounded the hill and waited. Months passed, and the Romans, without any military help from outside, finally agreed to negotiate a ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold. While they were weighing the gold, the Gauls' chief, Brennus, cheated them by using a heavier weight. When the Romans complained, Brennus threw his sword on the scale and said, "Vae victis." It means, "Woe to the conquered." This humiliating defeat was a massive wake-up call for Rome. They learned a lot from this failure. They debated in the Senate and analyzed every single factor of their loss. The most important conclusion? They needed to completely overhaul their military. The Romans were incredibly realistic. They would learn from their mistakes and create practical solutions. Their first lesson was to build a proper defense. They constructed a massive wall around the city, 11 kilometers long and 33 feet high. Made from volcanic stone, this wall was so strong that it was almost impossible to enter the city once its 16 gates were closed. It was called the Servian Wall, and you can still find parts of it in Rome today. But the second lesson was the most crucial. They made changes to their army that would turn it into the most powerful military in the world. They created an entirely new standing army, the first professional army in history. Recruitment and training standards became incredibly strict. Only young, physically fit Roman men could join. The army was divided into units of 6,000 soldiers called legions. To keep their soldiers focused, they weren't allowed to get married or own property. Their unit became their family, and this is why they fought so fiercely for each other. This cult-like devotion is a principle that modern armies still use today. The training was brutal. Every soldier had to carry up to 25 kilograms of gear, and the 3rd of March, 6 kilometers in 5 hours a day. Each soldier also had a special helmet with his name and social status etched into it. They were expected to treat their equipment like their life. And punishments were severe. If a soldier was caught sleeping on duty, he was stoned to death. If an entire unit fled from battle, they would line up in rows of 10, and every 10th soldier would be clubbed to death on the spot. This brutal punishment was called decimato in Latin, which is where we get the word decimation from. The Romans also perfected their weaponry. They used a long spear called a pilum, which was designed to bend after it hit an enemy shield. This made it impossible for the enemy to pull it out, forcing them to drop their shields. They also used a short double-edged sword called a gladius. This sword was perfect for fighting in tight formations, shoulder to shoulder, without clashing swords with their fellow soldiers. The meticulous design and discipline of this new army made them an unstoppable force. The Gauls would never dare attack them again. But the problem was, Rome's prosperity now depended on constant war and expansion. They couldn't stop. Their new military machine needed to be fed. They began to conquer all of mainland Italy, taking over small states and cities. They pushed their way south, all the way to the southern tip of the Italian mainland. Right across the Mediterranean Sea, just 1.5 kilometers away, was the island of Sicily, and Sicily was ruled by the greatest power of the time, the Carthaginian Empire. The two most powerful states in the ancient world are now face to face. A clash is inevitable. This is the empire that produced one of history's most famous commanders, Hannibal. The story of Rome's brutal war with Carthage and the end of the Roman Republic is coming in our next video. We'll show you how a small village became a global empire and what mistakes eventually led to the downfall of that 2 million square mile empire. If you want to find out what happens next, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single part of this epic story.